Well, hello and welcome to TransForm Tuesday. I'm Dave McCormick, VP of Products and Services here at Alpha Software. And today we're going to be talking about Alpha Transform, and specifically we're going to be talking about security. But I'm also here to take your questions. So if you have any questions, go ahead and type them into the questions box of the GoToWebinar control panel. I'm also joined today by Sarah Mitchell, who's in charge of our documentation department. She'll be there to answer your questions as well. So before we get started, I just want to check in with Sarah real quick to make sure that my voice is coming through and that you can see my screen.
Yes, you're coming through fine.
Excellent. Thanks very much. Okay, so as Transform expands, a lot of our early use cases and customers, I should call them partners really, have been using Transform for doing things like keeping track of field service types of operations, maybe making repairs, checking for energy efficiency in homes and so on. But some of our newer partners are interested in using Transform for healthcare. And one of the big things they want to use it for is for patient input or patient intake, I guess is what you want to call it. So that's where someone shows up to your hospital or your clinic or your doctor's office, and instead of giving them a piece of paper to fill out, you hand them instead a tablet and they fill out their personal health information on that tablet. That, of course, raises the question of privacy and security. We know that health records need to be guarded, as do credit card numbers and other types of very high secure information. So let's pop down, and today we're going to be talking a little bit about security and what can be done in Alpha Transform, how it works, how to harden it, and a few other topics. So to begin with, Transform is in fact built with security in mind, but if you read the user's agreement, and a lot of people don't, I don't blame you if you didn't, we do say right out of the box that it really shouldn't be used for storing credit card numbers. It shouldn't be used for storing personal health information and other types of personal information. We have a fairly secure system here, but what I would like to tell you basically what the risks are and what you can do to sort of harden those risks so that Transform is appropriate for those types of applications. To begin, I think a lot of you are familiar with the term security through obscurity, but if you're not, let me explain it. It'll only take a minute. Security through obscurity is the belief, and it's a bad idea, as I'm saying right here, is the bad idea that, that you can secure a system simply by not telling anyone how the system works on the inside. The idea is it's a black box and really no one knows how it works. No one will know how to hack it. It turns out that is dead wrong. As it turns out, it usually just exactly the sorts of people who you don't want knowing how to hack something are the people who learn those skills. And so really, there's been a trend to really avoid security through obscurity and instead make your systems, in fact, more transparent, not more hidden. And the idea is that if everyone knows how it works, we can work together in a partnership to make things even more secure than they are already. And it's based on that idea that we don't want to use security through obscurity. We want to do transparency, that I'm giving today's presentation in which I'm going to reveal how Transform works underneath the covers and where your data is actually going. So we'll start right here on this slide. This has to do with the data that's in transit and data at rest. It's one of the major concepts in security is where is the data and is it protected? And where is it at each point? So let's just talk about this. Here I've got this little block diagram here, and it includes the two parts of Transform that you're familiar with. It Transform Central, which is the website that you build your applications in and review your data, and the Transform application where the data is typically collected, although you can do some data collection and type it into Transform Central as well. Starting over here at the mobile app, when information is entered into the phone, we use the operating system of the device, whether it's Android or iOS, to perform encryption on the data. These devices do this brilliantly, and it is extremely hard without knowing the password to break into someone's phone and get data off of the phone. There have been many high-profile court cases in which governments have asked to create backdoors and so on. And as far as we know, there is no such thing as a backdoor right now for security. So these are actually really quite secure places to keep your data is on a mobile phone. There is an exception. While iOS, I believe, always requires that you have a security code filled in, that is not the case for Android, or at least for some variations of Android. And without that security code, it does not guarantee, that security code is used as a key to encrypt your data. So without a security code, there's no guarantee that your data are in fact encrypted on the device. So if you have Android users using the device, you need to make sure that they have a passcode on their phone. There are ways of ensuring that. I won't talk about that today, but we can talk about that in future sessions. So anyway, device, as long as you've got your a password or a PIN in place, is fairly safe right here on the TransForm app. We can even talk about how to get data off of the app remotely if a phone gets lost or if an employee quits or something like that. Now, the communication between the TransForm app and TransForm Central itself, when data is sent and retrieved and synchronized, that's also a secure HTTPS or TLS connection between those two. And that's, that's perfectly high security, the kind that you use already for banking and for accessing health records and so on. So that's sort of state of the art connecting those two together. When you get over to TransForm, TransForm also has the TLS encryption that assures that between your terminal and TransForm Central, all of the data is encrypted going back and forth there. Now, there are a couple other areas here, though, to keep in mind. When you are saving your media files, as opposed to just data, so media files, I mean specifically pictures and audio files. We don't do video yet, but I think that's coming soon. Those get placed up, again encrypted, on the way up at least, onto Amazon S3. At S3, I'm not sure if they're encrypted or not. I suspect they are not. And to retrieve them, though, it's also encrypted on the way back. So if you have photographs that are sensitive photographs you think could be personally identifiable, and you think that's going to be a big security issue, you can talk to us about how we secure that S3 there. But I wanted to point out that that's one of the things that's sometimes overlooked, that not all of your data is just strictly going to a database. Some of it we're actually storing up here on S3. Now, once it goes into TransForm Central itself has got a backend database, and I'm going to tell you about how that works. The backend database securely transmits your data to a database over here. And in order to get access to that database, of course, needs an authorization, username, and password, which only we have, which only TransForm Central servers have. But it is also pinned to a particular IP address. So even if somehow you stole Alpha's master username and password, you need to have their same IP address to access that database to begin with. And we consider that security to be sufficient for 90% of cases. However, you should keep in mind that once it's stored here in that database, it is stored in an unencrypted format. So in the very unlikely event someone was able to, I don't know, spoof an IP address, get hold of the username, get hold of the password, and so on, if they were to pull the data down, that data would not be encrypted. So one option is, if you talk to our professional services team, is we can talk about setting you up with a database that's actually different than the shared database that's used with TransForm Central, but your own database, that in which case you could do encryption options. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. So the data is safe, but it is unencrypted. To get to it still requires authentication and all that, but that's how it's stored. Okay, moving on to the next slide. Keep in mind that database is also a shared database. So your data, my data, Acme Corporation's data, it all goes into the same database. Now the danger with that, and it's happened in some applications, but never in TransForm, and typically not in Alpha Anywhere applications, is that if a programmer of the system, not one of your programs, one of our programmers here at Alpha, had made some sort of error, it would be possible for someone else's data to bleed into your account, or their data, worse yet, to bleed into someone else's account. In other words, they'd log in and they'd start seeing your information. This is an inherent danger of a shared database. We have gotten over or mitigated that to a large extent by creating a special kind of database driver that we use underneath the hood, which makes it so that before a programmer can program in a database call, it goes through this driver to make sure that a valid formed ID query is passed along with that, so that you don't accidentally mix up data from one place to the other because you forgot to specify which particular records you were looking at. So in other words, every record has to have a query ID that goes, or every database query needs to have a ID that goes along with that in order to pull that data back. And that is what can help prevent any types of leakage of sharing. Again, this has never happened in TransForm, and we have built precautions into Alpha Anywhere, which is what Alpha TransForm is built on to prevent that type of error. However, again, if we went through a professional services engagement and you wanted to have your own separate database, of course, that would completely eliminate the shared database risk. Okay, moving down. We had talked about this before on S3. S3 is the one, I think, exception to the obscurity by obscurity rule, and that is that if you have an extremely long URL, which is generated by S3 and saved in TransForm, and you happen to have that URL, you would be able to get that data out of Amazon S3, basically by pasting it to a browser. You'd be able to get your media files back that way. That is extremely unlikely. I mean, these keys are extremely long. These the URLs have keys built into them. We don't think it's an issue. On the other hand, if you'd like to talk to us about a particular scenario, we can talk about how we could potentially harden that once it makes it to S3 as well. Next up, okay, so that's S3. Next up has to do with integrations. Okay, these aren't things that TransForm has out of the box. Well, it has the ability to do these out of the box, but until you program them, they're not actually hooked up. The first one is Zapier, and we've covered that in several sessions in the past. And what Zapier lets you do is it lets you take data out of TransForm as well as put data back into TransForm, and take that data and use it with any of like 1,000 other applications which are also compatible with Zapier. So if you haven't seen this before, this is really quite cool. You can find it at zapier.com. But obviously, anything that you do with Zapier, you're going to have to rely on the strength and the security behind Zapier. And that may be too big a risk. Certainly some clients we've talked to before have said that they don't know of anything particularly wrong with Zapier, but they prefer not to go through some third-party system, especially with sensitive data, which I can appreciate. Another feature that's built into Alpha Anywhere is an on-submit webhook. So what that means is when data is submitted into TransForm, or when records are synchronized, we can make an API call automatically using a webhook and pass along all of that data. Now, we can absolutely encode that data, but it requires that the webhook on the other side also be secure. So that's where a possible weakness is. It's not necessarily in the TransForm system. It's what happens after TransForm delivers that data to the webhook. The third part is the API. So any system that you build to access TransForm obviously needs to be secure. If the system that is accessing TransForm with the API key is not secure, that means that your instance of, or your account for TransForm isn't secure either. That should go without saying, but it's just worth a reminder that anything that you tack on, you need to make sure that that's secure as well, as we secure our software up to that point. Moving on, very, very similar concept. In Alpha Anywhere, in the TransForm application, the client-side application, you have the ability to write AJAX callbacks to go look up data against a server. For example, you might want to look up up-to-date part levels. You might want to find out what the current weather forecast is before you embark on a job. Maybe it's important that it's above freezing or below freezing before you do something. There are many ways, and many examples that I've shown before as to how an API could be very useful. But keep in mind that when you're using an API, you are transmitting data from the TransForm app out into that API. Again, we can wrap this up with TLS security. However, just keep in mind that that API on the other side, whether you've created it or someone's created it for you, also needs to be secure. So lastly, everything that we've done so far is up on a cloud. So our database is up on a cloud, TransForm is up on a cloud, and these are shared clouds. So again, there's always the possibility, although extremely unlikely, of data mingling. We do have some options. Again, this is a professional services engagement, so you'd have to work with us for licensing and things like that to do this. But we could very well move TransForm off of our cloud and either onto a private cloud or onto servers that you have located in your own building. So instead of using, and you can do that for both the TransForm system, but we could also do it just for the database as well, which may be sufficient since data is not actually stored in the TransForm system itself. It's only stored in its backend database. So for example, if you decided on premise you have Oracle database or something like that that you would like to use instead of our shared cloud that comes built into TransForm, you could talk to us about that and we could do a little bit of engineering and get that to work that way. So it's something that we've considered. All right, just to wrap up, there are a few other security considerations that I would like to talk about. The first has to do with device management. And so, for example, if an employee, say, leaves your company and they had used their cell phone with your application, you can, of course, deauthorize them at any point right in TransForm Central so that they're no longer able to log in or get the data off of their phone. So that's an easy solution for that. So that works whether the phone is lost or whether the employee leaves. But keep in mind that it is important that there's a certain amount of security because logins last 2 days. So if let's say it was a malicious employee disappeared, for a couple of days after you had shut them off, they wouldn't be able to synchronize any of the data, but they'd still be able to look at any data that they had personally collected on their phone. Probably not a big deal, but it's something to keep in mind. Next word is password strengths. We do not actually enforce this, although we're thinking of putting this on the roadmap, is making people use strong passwords. Strong passwords, multiple characters, uppercase, lowercase, numbers, letters, symbols, all of that. They're all valid in our passwords, but we don't require a particular strength. If that's important to you, we can probably speed that up on the roadmap. Otherwise, it will be implemented pretty soon. Another thing that's on the roadmap is two-factor authorization. Currently, we don't do that. Not much more else to say about that other than it would be a good thing to support. And another thing, this is keeping data anonymous. So in one particular instance, we're working with a client who has sensitive data, but the sensitive data is about patients. So as they collect patient data, instead of collecting the name of the patient or their social security number or some other easily identifiable piece of information, they instead use a token, an anonymized token, so that when the data is collected in the database, it isn't until later, once it's safely back on the server, that they're able to match up the name of the patient with the data that's being collected. So that is another great way of keeping data safe. It's one of multiple techniques, but it's one that one of our customers is using, and I wanted to tell you about that. Lastly, if you recall, I had mentioned that, of course, there's always a danger when you are making API calls out from your TransForm application that you are leaking data. One possibility would be, for example, if you had made a programming error when you wrote your TPL code and you ended up sending the data to the wrong URL or something like that. What we can do in Alpha Anywhere, in the TransForm Central specifically, is you can create a whitelist for your TPL code. And so with the whitelist for the TPL code that appears in the on the Home tab, and I can show you how to do that, it requires that only if you're going to make a call that URL appears in the whitelist. Now, this isn't set up by default. In other words, if you leave the whitelist for URLs, for AJAX callback URLs blank, you'll be able to call any URL you want using your TPL code. But a better practice is if you know there's only 2 or 3 or a handful or whatever particular endpoints that you're interested in using, you could put those into the whitelist, and then that way if any error was made in your TPL code, it won't be able to just send your data some random place. It'll instead error out like it's supposed to. So that is that for the overview of TransForm security, and we will be working on this in weeks to come to sort of tighten this up and work on some other areas. I was just wondering though, do we have any questions? Let me go ahead and click the questions button. It doesn't look like it. Well, if you do have any questions about security or concerns about security or anything else that has to do with TransForm, go ahead and send them to tfservice, as in TransForm service, at alphasoftware.com. Thanks very much, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Sarah, for being here. Hope to see you next week. Take care and have a great week. Bye-bye.